being able to understand and become more curious about why we're being triggered in this moment is so important. Because in all honesty, right, in a very objective way, there can be two parts of a trigger. There's the understanding that if someone's triggering us, that means that they have control over us.
Right.
And that's really interesting if you think about it. If you're able to separate yourself from that and really be able to become curious about that, like, why am I giving this much power in this moment to the state?
Right. To a player, to a referee, to a
Yes.
parent.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. And so that's why pausing is so important, because if we can, and some of these triggers can carry such a huge charge too, right? That signal is so strong,
Yeah.
right? And so part of the work for a lot of us is disrupting that signal. And the only way we can disrupt that signal is if we are consciously aware that we're triggered.
Right.
That's where it begins.
Could you give an example of like a trigger and how to disrupt that?
Yeah. When we think about, it can be something as simple as not feeling heard, right? You might be practicing with an athlete, and this athlete has issues at home. They might have issues with other coaches. They might have a lot of trauma. Talking about taking on that community aspect. So here in United States, when people get triggered, we kind of treat that as that's their problem to deal with, right? And it doesn't contribute to the healing process or the recovery process, right? In Japan, it's different. When people get triggered, it's an indication that the group synergy is off. So we need to fix this. And not that that triggers my responsibility, but how can I better show up for you in that moment? So if we're noticing our players' affect change, and sometimes they're not going to always tell us, right? We have to attune to what's happening in the room, which means if we notice facial expressions changing
Right.
and they're so subtle, right? We can ask questions, what do you need in this moment, right? And that can open up so much of the lay ground, if you will, of exploring what that trigger might be for them in that moment.
I'm big on asking questions. It's a big thing because
Yeah.
player autonomy is huge. And I feel like one of the things that I'm also hearing you're kind of talking about these kind of cultural nuances and that you can kind of bring into sport. We can probably dive super in depth into kind of the cultural nuances in the United States, but keeping it on topic of sports and teams is I feel like, and you can kind of explain the science behind this is I always reference it as a we, right? I always reference like I always take responsibility for, a team, like let's say if we lost, right? It's our responsibility. And so you're kind of talking about a group synergy, talking about a trigger. And I feel like the best teams are connected with that synergy, like you talk about, versus like it was your fault you turned the basketball over instead of like let's be solution oriented. Like I see that you're frustrated that I made a bad pass, my bad. Like am I getting on the right track or is that making sense?
Yeah. So and I want to make sure I'm answering the original question too about what can we do in moments when we're triggered.
Yep.
Right. And I think what you're asking is how do we take ownership while also communicating accountability, maybe?
Yep.
Yeah. And it's so one of the frameworks that I try to put on in this work is that life is a dance, right? And we can't hold someone accountable when they're in the state when they're not stabilized. It would be nice to do that,
Right.
right? But the reality of the situation is that we're dealing with human beings. And so one of the first things that we can offer is compassion, which is lacking in our society. Compassion is the gateway to flow. Beating someone up isn't, psychologically. And this is work we all have to work on because we live in a culture that reinforces these ideas that you have to beat yourself up.
Mm.
You have to go harder and harder and harder. But that's actually not what the science says. That's not what all these great cultures have taught us about the human condition. And we keep missing this point over and over again, is that the path towards connecting is always compassion.
I actually, this is really a cool insight because this is something I've been honestly personally working on more, just on my own shortcomings, right? As a fiance, as a basketball coach, as a business owner. Instead of like you saying, like traditionally I would beat myself up, I kind of continue to repeat the pattern. And one thing that I see, right, and it's early on and change is hard. I do see better results that if I do mess up, I do make a mistake. I've been trying to give myself more compassion and I actually see myself like for some reason, like I'm like kind of releasing some of that control. Like I'm not going to be a
There we
perfect
go.
person, right? And so that's
There we go.
been one of my biggest areas. Is like I think I'm realizing like I was more of a control freak than I maybe put out. Like I'm this chill West Coast guy, but at the same time, right? There's a lot of variables I want to control. And offering that compassion for myself and my own mistakes has actually been really important in my growth process this past month.
That's beautiful. Well said. And I think it's important for us who are leaders within the community to admit that we're still working on these things.
Right.
And I'm so thank you for acknowledging that. Vulnerability is power.
Yes.
And when athletes and when members within the community can hear you admit that you have faults, and again, we don't live in a society that fosters this, right? When you're secure within yourself, vulnerability is power. So when you can, I look, another suggestion is that I look for opportunities to say that I messed up. My mentor one time and my therapist, we got into a little disagreement one time, and this is sad but exciting at the same time. This happened about 2 or 3 years ago. I had enough courage to tell him what he did. And I'm so used of people gaslighting and evading me. But to my surprise, he looked me in my eye and he said, "That is mine and that is my fault." So he modeled something that was so important to me, right? Which is accountability. You also mentioned something very important, which is surrendering. It's okay to be messy in life.
Yeah.
We live in a very perfectionistic state of
Yeah.
mind. And what you just described was, when are we going to allow, what space and room is there for children, for teens to make mistakes, for athletes to make mistakes? And they should be able to make mistakes. They need to make as many mistakes as possible, in fact, because that's the path towards greatness.
That's where you learn, right? You learn from those mistakes and those opportunities. And instead of being a 17-year-old playing in a 15U tournament because you want to score 35 points and have 0 assists and be perfect, right? That's not going to help you grow if you want to be a college athlete. And so that's obviously an oversimplification of, like, I feel like even us as coaches, right? And parents, we like try to have our kids fail the least amount possible, when in reality, the more mistakes, as long as we create an environment where we can help them have the tools to go within, right? We can actually help them accelerate their growth through by looking at those mistakes and identifying, okay, that's okay. Now let's improve.
Exactly. And I would also challenge the improvement part though too, ironically.
Yeah.
Right? Because we do want to learn from mistakes, but we also want to encourage an environment where it's okay not to improve. Because again, if we're talking about flow, right? Flow needs to be expansive and not limiting. And when we're talking about being accountable and owning certain things, while that's true, to get into a rhythm in life, right?